Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lindsay Robinson. I'm the Executive Director of the California Cannabis Industry Association. Thank you so much for joining us today on our post-election federal webinar. We're very happy to have all of you. We're going to do a bit of a Q&A at the end of our session. So if you have questions throughout, feel free to use the question function on the right side panel bar under the control panel. You can just go ahead and type questions in, and we'll try to get to those if we don't cover them throughout our talk today. We're very excited to have our friends from the Liaison Group, Safira Galoob and David Mangone. We work closely with the Liaison Group. As most of you know, they are our federal lobbyists. So one benefit of being a member of CCIA is that you not only get state lobbying, you also get federal lobbying on behalf of important cannabis policy reform issues. So I'm very happy to have both of you here today, and happy that you could make the time to join us. I know things have probably been pretty crazy in DC the last week or so. I think many of us, hopefully most of us, are breathing a sigh of relief that we have a Biden-Harris administration to look forward to. And I know, most of us are not single issue voters, so there's a lot of complexity and a lot of emotion usually involved in elections. This one was probably over the top for almost all of us. I know last week was incredibly exhausting, and really the weeks leading up to it too. So we're excited to take a look at projections of what we think is going to happen on the federal landscape for cannabis policy reform. Obviously, we know the elections are going to affect state level policy as well, and local. So last Friday, CCIA did a deep dive into state level reform with our membership, and we'll be doing that again on our next membership meeting, which is next Friday. So if you're a member of CCIA and you want to do a deeper dive into state level, plan to hop onto our membership call next Friday at noon. But for the time being, let's talk all things federal. First off, before we get started though, I do want to thank all of our CCIA members who are hopping on the webinar today. We're happy to have you. We couldn't do this work without you. Again, if you want to submit any questions, you can do so through the question tab under the control panel. And I want to say hi to any of our CCIA board members who are here. Thank you so much for your ongoing leadership. And to Eddie Franco, he's the wizard behind the curtain today on the back end of the webinar. So thanks, Eddie. Okay, so how about a brief introduction from Safira, and then we'll pop over to David.
Thanks, Lindsay. Really happy to be with everyone today. Really happy that we have really important results from this weekend. It's interesting, we had positioned the timing of this webinar thinking that we would have all the information we needed, and I think we have most of the information that we need. And we certainly, I think we have at least an idea of what the two pathways are. And today I hope that we can talk a little bit about what the impact is of what both of those pathways are. Obviously, the outcome of the presidency, the outcome of the House, and we're going to get into more specifically the outcome of the Senate. But the goal here is to really begin to set the tone and start to put some more detail on the strategy for what our 2021 federal cannabis reform strategy looks like. So thanks for having me, and I'll let David do a couple of opening remarks, and then we'll get started.
Sure, great to be here with you, Lindsay, and with Safira as well. As you mentioned, it's been a pretty hectic few days in Washington. We are starting to see a return to at least legislative normalcy. I think there's still some outliers with litigation ongoing from the president, as well as just the general feel of having a Congress operate during its end of year priorities during a pandemic. But certainly, I think you're seeing the coverage of the local publications, Politico, The Hill, shift away from what results mean, and now starting to talk about the potential of a transition.
Great, thank you so much for being here. For those who are just joining, welcome. This is CCIA's post-election federal webinar with the Liaison Group. We're happy that you can join us. Okay, we're going to dive in. Eddie is helping to control the slides, so we can just give him a heads up whenever we need to move forward.
Okay. I think we are ready for the next one.
Next slide.
So I wanted to start and give a brief overview of what happened around the country beyond what happened with the results of the presidential House and Senate. Tuesday was an absolute banner day for cannabis reform. In all 5 states that there were initiatives, all of those initiatives passed. And not only did they pass by margins in many places that garnered more votes than either presidential candidate. So Arizona passed their adult use legalization by 60%. New Jersey passed theirs by 67%. Mississippi passed a medical initiative by 74%. Montana passed adult use by 57%. And South Dakota passed their medical use by 69% and their adult use by 53%. So what this really showed is that cannabis, as we all have known on this call, has become increasingly of a bipartisan issue. For adult use initiatives to win in incredibly red states like Montana, like Arizona, though Arizona, as we all saw, is flipping. But certainly the success of these initiatives, it makes it very difficult, I think, for Republicans to continue to deny the importance of dealing with this issue in some way, shape, or form on the federal level. So I think that the state initiatives and their successes really open up the door for us as we look to the next Congress. We'll have some new unlikely allies. We saw in 2016 when North Dakota passed their medical initiative, Senator Kevin Cramer came on board and had basically said that now that his state had decided, he was going to do everything he could to protect the vote. So we're hopeful that we'll see some more of that sort of turnaround from Republican members of the GOP Senate. So with that, I will transition to Zafira about Senate control as we look to the next Congress. Still muted.
I was told to unmute every time, but that was a little bit more responsibility I think I can handle.
I'm so sorry to do that to you.
Again, I need tech support. So while David started, I think, David, we're ready to go to the next slide. Is that correct? Yeah. So we can go to the next slide. Actually, we'll hold off, but I'll say that the Senate. So despite the successes that David shared in the states, it's really the tale of 2 stories, I think, for what happened for cannabis in our country over the past 10 days. And while, as Lindsay mentioned, many of us are not single issue voters, and while the Biden administration, we are hoping to, and we're going to get into more detail about this, should be a much more receptive climate and landscape with the Biden-Harris leadership. The Senate's continued lead by Mitch McConnell is going to make our efforts in the Senate continue to be difficult. As of today, it's 48 Republicans, 48 Democrats. We have 2 states that are still outstanding. But those are likely to go Republican, Alaska and North Carolina. And as many of you who kind of have watched these elections, the 2 Georgia seats that were in play will proceed to a runoff in January. And while it is possible that we could get some Democrat success in Georgia, very realistically, I don't think at this point, we'll see both seats flip. Now, that could change, and I'm not trying to be a pessimist about it. I think the Democrats are really hoping it will change, and the Republicans are really hoping to hold steady. There's going to be more money put into this race than maybe we will have ever seen, but I think we as the industry have to be prepared for Mitch McConnell holding on to the Senate. I'll say on the House, and well, actually, let's talk a little bit about some of the changes with the leadership, David Mangone, before we get into the House.
Yeah, and just a quick comment on the money flowing into this Georgia Senate race. It's going to be one of the most expensive campaigns ever. But that being said, almost $200 million came into Kentucky trying to unseat Mitch McConnell, and he still won by a comfortable margin. So while money certainly helps with ad buys and voter outreach, it doesn't necessarily predict what's going to happen on the ground. But yeah, both sides are going to be spending an exorbitant amount of money trying to get these seats so they can have the Senate majority. But with that, as we look to leadership changes, there's two things to consider. And the first is committee chairmanships. There'll be some shuffling of committee chairs where cannabis legislation typically goes through, namely Senate Judiciary. Senator Grassley of Iowa will be coming back to his post as the top Republican on that chair. And it looks at this point that Senator Feinstein will retain her post as either ranking member or chairwoman. I say at this point looks like it. There was some pushback on how Senator Feinstein handled the confirmation hearings of Justice Barrett. Leadership, including Senator Durbin, I think hinted publicly that they were unhappy with how she handled the hearing. I don't know if it's enough to unseat her from this top spot. Certainly as serving as long as she has in the Senate, it seems unlikely that she would be demoted at this point, but that's certainly a possibility. The other chair to look out for is going to be of the Banking Committee. Senator Crapo is moving to the Senate Finance Committee. It is looking likely that Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania will be taking the top spot for Republicans on Senate banking. That is good news overall for the safe banking bill. As Senator Crapo is from one of the now only 2 states without any form of cannabis, thanks to South Dakota for narrowing that gap, but one of the only 2 states, he didn't have a natural constituency to tell him that it was important for banking to get done. Pennsylvania has a robust medical cannabis market. New Jersey just passed adult use, and there are murmurings in the State House in Pennsylvania of an adult use bill being run either during the lame duck session in Pennsylvania or as early as January. So I think when you look at the constituencies, talking to Chairman Toomey, you're going to see that he may not necessarily want to help the cannabis industry, but he'll be hearing from bankers, both community and statewide in his state, saying, look, there's a massive amount of money in our state, and a lot of it is now fleeing over the border to New Jersey. Help our businesses out and keep jobs in Pennsylvania. So I think that'll be a compelling argument for him, one that we weren't necessarily able to make with Chairman Crapo. So certainly the committees are going to be something to watch out for. They've already announced the leadership for the Senate, but committee chairs won't be announced until later this month. The second type of change that we should look out for is any Democrats that are going to be tapped by the Biden administration to come into cabinet posts. Certainly the most obvious for this call is with Senator Harris being in the White House, there'll be an empty seat for Gavin Newsom to fill. Certainly that is something probably you all are much more knowledgeable about the prospects, of who that might be, but that will be a shakeup. And then there's been talk of other Democratic senators, including Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders potentially having cabinet positions. So, while that may not change the balance of power in the Senate, it may lead for some new, fresh faces dealing with cannabis reform, for better or for worse. We don't know what that looks like yet. We don't know the difficulties that a Biden administration would have confirming their nominees. If the Supreme Court battle is any indication, Biden's nominees will probably have to be on the more moderate side to move through the confirmation process. But again, that's to be seen, and that's going to depend on the results of the Georgia race in January. So with that, Sapphira, I think we can go to the next slide and talk about what we can do executively.
Well, and before we actually get to that slide, I have a couple of more items. Sorry, we can go to the next slide. But I will say I'd like to add 2 things to what David shared and talk a little bit about the House, because I did jump around a little bit. One piece is that Pat Toomey, likely Chairman-elect Toomey, is announced his retirement. I'm sorry, David, if you mentioned that or if I missed it when I was thinking through. So in 2 years, he's set to retire, which means that needing to answer towards a constituency for re-elect won't be part of the equation. But at the same time, he's not been a pro-cannabis champion for us. He is really keen on capital markets and access to capital by small businesses. And so I do think that is going to help. And we do have a lot of friends in the Pennsylvania cannabis industry who are on both sides of the aisle and can parlay that messaging to them. Secondly, Doug Jones from Alabama, who, as you watched, was not successful in his seat. And what's notable, if he's actually tapped the Attorney General, he's one of the names that's been floated because he's in the market for a job and he's qualified and he's moderate. Even though I know there's other contenders, notably with him is one of his lead staffers came out of Merkley's office. And so she is very cannabis savvy. She understands the history of where we've been in terms of protections and lack of protections. And as many of you all know from California, having the right staff in the right places at the right time can really direct what's possible and probable. So with that in mind, we can go to the Biden-Harris administration and move slides here. Oh, sorry, I forgot to talk about the House. So many things to cover always. So in the same way I said that cannabis was very successful in the states and not so successful federally, interestingly on the House, the House Republican caucus really had a huge series of upsets in districts that they were toss-up districts. And so the wide margin, the 41 seat margin that the Democrats had enjoyed in 2018 was not maintained or expanded as projected. And in fact, now we are looking at, it's about 218 to 198, 215 to 190. Really, we've got still some races that are outstanding, so we'll call it 215 to 198. But the Republicans gained back a lot of their seats and narrowed that margin. And so in 2 years, you can imagine there's going to be a big effort to narrow it. What that means is that if cannabis reform needs to progress in the House, and we're going to talk about the MORE Act and the timing of it in December, but I think as industry stakeholders, we have to be very responsible and responsive to political realities on the Hill. And so we want to make sure that when we advance our what's possible, that we're mindful that if we don't get something now, we may or may not be in a position, it may be a worse position in 2 years. And so I'm not trying to be a skeptic, but being a realist, I really want to make sure that we get some real changes and some real improvements when we can, and we are mindful of what we can accomplish. That being said, as we move into the administration, I think and I'm going to have David go into this a little bit more, but I'll kick it off. I think we are really going to think about, push for, and discuss as early as possible reinstatement of some of the agency memorandums, including memorandums that we had, such as a coal memorandum, and maybe expand it. There are ways, as we saw with coal, the coal memo, that you can utilize and leverage executive branch authority and jurisdiction to extend protections. I mean, the descheduling is a little bit tricky, and we can talk about it if we have some time. It'd be much more straightforward if we did it through Congress. But there are ways that we can reinstate some of the protections that the cannabis industry enjoyed before it was rescinded by Attorney General Sessions. David, do you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, something that's interesting as a result of Tuesday is obviously President Trump hasn't conceded formally yet, and that doesn't matter in terms of the overall transition of power, but it does impact the timing of when that transition can occur. Without his concession, his agency heads will not begin to participate in your typical transitions that you see. That includes use of office space, use of resources, so a new administration can hit the ground running. I think that over the next several weeks, maybe into December, you'll see more and more agency heads being willing to cooperate with a formal transition. But, that is something I wanted to note. But certainly, it seems as though the folks who are already on the Biden transition team are intent on really undoing a lot of the administrative actions that the Trump administration did. I have seen that the baseline for many of these administrative actions are returning to where they were at the final day of the Obama administration, including with things like the Paris Climate Accord, some of the international agreements. And I would suspect that that principle would ring true in the Department of Justice as well, returning to where they were at January at the end of Obama's second term. And that would include things like the Cole Memo. Of course, that we are hopeful that because the marketplace and cannabis industry and consumers have evolved since that point, that we would get some guidance with some additional coverage, additional feedback, and then further areas where prosecutorial discretion is outlined, not just the original 8 priorities in the Cole Memo. So we think that's certainly feasible, particularly with Senator Harris being in the White House. And we look forward to working with Department of Justice and the new administration to issue that document as soon as possible.
Oh, we muted you again, Safira. Sorry, we're getting a little bit of feedback when David's talking and you're unmuted. So Eddie he's muting you. Sorry.
Eddie, I love that you take control of when people can hear me or not. You just do your thing, Eddie. So next slide, please. So the next thing we're going to discuss is, so what's possible, what's probable? As you may recall, the Safe Banking Act was included, and I believe we reported to this. I don't remember the last time we had our discussion, but since our last discussion, I know we reported that it was in the first HEROES Act. That was a big, an exciting report that we had earlier in the summer. It was also, as many of you know, was included in the second version of the HEROES Act, which really meant that Speaker Pelosi was holding firm to her priority to advance this, very successful bipartisan policy and include it into a COVID relief package. And additionally, as you may know, it was also included in the Senate Democrats version of the bill, in Minority Leader Schumer's version of the bill. So we've seen it twice in the House, once in the Senate. We know that the White House, now lame duck, creates some dynamics that are a little unpredictable, as David mentioned, or perhaps not so unpredictable, I'm not sure. But really the best vehicle, we think, for safe banking is this next COVID relief package. We have heard from Leader McConnell that he is very interested in advancing a package. And because safe banking doesn't confer any additional price tag onto the bill, and it's got really broad bipartisan support, we've already started our advocacy effort to kind of leverage some of the members who come from the states who just recently passed, and to get messaging into the leader's office and the speaker's office that when a COVID package moves, safe banking must stay in. So that could happen at any time between now and the transition of the presidency on January 20th. But in the event that it doesn't, because it's possible that the politics are just too vitriolic that we won't be able to come up with a negotiated package, that one of the things we have heard Speaker Pelosi say, that if there is no COVID package that is achieved between now and Mr. Biden and President Biden and Vice President Harris starting their term, that will be the first piece of legislation that Speaker Pelosi would put forward, and likely she'd put the HEROES Act forward, which includes safe banking. So I'm going to predict safe banking by February 1st. Is that too optimistic, David? Yeah, those are jazz hands. Now, don't quote me on it, but I need some optimism here. I'm riding on the optimism from this weekend.
I like it. David, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, I agree with that assessment. Look, like looking at Senate leadership right now, less so Leader McConnell, but Roy Blunt is going to be chairing the Republican Senate Policy Committee. He is on record as supporting safe banking. Missouri's started sales now, and an issue, again, that 91 Republicans, including Kevin McCarthy, voted for in the House when it was just a standalone bill. I think we've seen lots of attacks from the Republican Party that, oh, Pelosi's bill mentions cannabis more than it mentions jobs. And certainly there's been some attacks on the diversity studies to be conducted by the Government Accountability Office. But I think Republicans across the board, and even Mitch McConnell has been very careful about how he's criticized safe banking. He's criticized, government-funded studies. He's never actually criticized the policy itself, particularly from an economic standpoint. And he knows that his constituency, particularly hemp farmers in Kentucky, really need this bill. There is, from a banker's perspective, no real way to distinguish between hemp and full plant cannabis. So if bankers in Kentucky are saying, like, look, we are hesitant to provide any service whatsoever, whether it's cannabis or hemp, that's certainly going to go a long way in convincing Mitch McConnell that this is not the worst policy in the world. And particularly when you can hide it in a larger package like COVID relief or like appropriations, it makes that vote a lot easier. That way, at the end of the day, people on both sides can say, hey, we didn't get everything that we wanted in this package, but this package is right for the American people. It's good for jobs. It's good for economic and healthcare relief. So, I think this is our best window. Certainly, if the Democrats were to take the Senate, I would say with not 100% confidence, but very close, that a Heroes with SAFE would pass because of the ability to use a tool called budget reconciliation, where you would only need 51 votes instead of the traditional 60. But yeah, I'm very optimistic about SAFE this year, and if not, in early 2021.
Great. I'm going to take this time now to reiterate, if folks have questions, you can go ahead and use the question function within the webinar, the Zoom webinar, my apologies. And we'll be getting to a little Q&A here very soon. So feel free to send along your questions. So let's talk a little bit about the MORE Act.
David, do you want to do more and I'll do appropriations?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Go ahead. You do more and I'll do appropriations.
So yeah, yesterday we got a letter from Leader Hoyer, who is the majority whip in the House, with the schedule for the rest of the year. And in that schedule, most notably, he reiterated his commitment, which he had made earlier this summer, to have a floor vote on the MORE Act. We are likely looking at the first or second week of December, based on timing of that memo. And so what's interesting about the MORE Act is it had been scheduled for a vote before the November elections. Leader Hoyer and Speaker Pelosi had gotten some pressure from moderate Democrats that they didn't want to take a vote on the MORE Act. They viewed it as controversial before their election. Somewhat ironically, all of those Democrats who had asked to not take a vote on it have now either lost their seats or are in tight races. And there isn't a single person who is a sponsor of the MORE Act who has lost their race. Whether that's a direct correlation, I'm not sure if that's something that's widely understood by your average voter, but it is an interesting policy position to show that, perhaps where the Democratic Party was hedging and taking care of their moderates, they should have been looking more towards the progressive wing. And I think that's going to be a larger dynamic of a power struggle you're going to see within the House caucus for Democrats over the next 2 years. It's whether to cater to the more moderate members or whether to cater to the more progressive wing. But certainly, the news of a MORE Act vote is really exciting. It's obviously the first time that there will be a floor vote on the change of the status of cannabis since it was added to the Controlled Substances Act. At this point with a Republican Senate, it does look like it's challenging to move that bill in the upper chamber, but it will effectively set the stage for cannabis reform going forward. I think this is Democrats' line in the sand in the House saying, like, any reform that we should consider should have these elements of racial and social justice, these elements of small business assistance, and these elements of criminal justice reform. So I think any cannabis bill that you see, so long as Democrats maintain the House majority, even if it is a slimmer one than it was before, you'll see the principles of the MORE Act be worked into hearings, into new cannabis bills. And I think we will ultimately end up continuing to do piecemeal legislation, dealing with the issue bit by bit. But certainly it is going to be a big, bold statement from the House Democrats about this is what reform should look like. And I think you will have that be echoed certainly by Leader Schumer in the Senate when it comes to Democratic positioning on the issue. Again, Democrats don't control everything at this point. They may not control everything in 2021. So there may need to be some compromise and some moderation, but certainly it's encouraging to see a vote dealing with descheduling coming next month.
Yeah, I love the fact that it could really kind of cement that line in the sand a bit, and in terms of that any policy reform moving forward are going to have those core tenets. And I think I think that alone, like I got goosebumps when you were just talking about it, because that alone just feels like such historic progress. And while everything in the cannabis industry is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and sometimes not even a full step forward, 2 steps forward, but that feels like real progress. And I'm extremely hopeful that that those priorities will kind of rise to the top with the new administration as well. So
yeah,
I think,
and I think there is that opportunity. There has a good bit of the Biden-Harris campaign has been focused on criminal justice reform and recognizing the racial inequalities that are going on with policing, with prison reform. So I think there's certainly going to be an opportunity for a bipartisan criminal justice package that may tackle some of the issues that are contained in the MORE Act. Similar to what was done with the First Step Act, but perhaps creating a broader net of individuals who are eligible for expungements, and certainly looking at Biden's platform, and certainly Senator Harris's platform, Vice President-elect Harris, which is fun to say, platform. I think you do see some of those reforms incorporated into a larger social justice bill.
I'm very much looking forward to the Madam Vice President.
Indeed.
Sophia, you want to talk about appropriations? You do need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Though, sorry.
Yes,
there you go.
This is like the story of Sophia and her mute button. I do want to add a bit of not that I want to take away the enthusiasm or your goosebumps, Lindsay, but I will say that even if the 2 Georgia seats that I referred to earlier in our discussion were to go Democratic, and we were to get, so that would make it 50-50, and Vice President-elect Harris would be the tie-breaking vote. As a reminder, if it's not budget reconciliation and it's not voting for a Supreme Court justice or justice judicial nomination, it's the rules in the Senate are still 60 votes because of the filibuster rules. And it is the case that in the event that we have a majority leader Schumer, if that's the case, whether or not the filibuster rules, they call it exercise the nuclear option to remove that 60 vote rules, that would have nothing to do with cannabis reform. It would have to do with a broader political equation, of which we would be kind of a consequence. And so I do think it's very realistic that without a broader vehicle, which David referred to, a broader crime bill, that something like the MORE Act or elements of the MORE Act could be included in. It's unrealistic that the MORE Act vote that we're going to see in the House will find a parallel track in the Senate, even if we are a Democratic Senate. So I want to set expectations for our industry stakeholders that we are still dealing with the tale of 2 chambers and the politics therein. We learned yesterday that the appropriations bills on the Senate, so it's a reminder, appropriations bills, that's what we use to fund the government, and cannabis has enjoyed protections through medical cannabis industry stakeholders. Originally it was called the Rohrabacher language, but it defunds the Department of Justice from interfering in the implementation of cannabis, medical cannabis industry. And it's been in place, it's been the thing that we've relied on as industry. And the appropriations language that we are currently living under is actually last year's appropriations, FY 2020. we are currently negotiating, we meaning the House and the Senate, FY 2021. And the House had completed their appropriations work. I mean, in the spring, I think we actually reported on it like several webinars ago. And the House bills, remember your civics class, I'm just a bill, I'm only a bill, advanced out of the House appropriations measures that expanded the protections to include adult use, as well as veterans access and immigration support and loans for education loans, a whole panoply of protections for the cannabis industry, even more so than we had in the prior year's appropriations. But that was on the House side. Remember that the Senate must pass their package, which they advanced yesterday, and as expected, it only included the protections for medical. So if you can imagine, we have, 8 to 10 measures, and I don't have the number exactly at the top of my head on the House side, and we have 1 on the Senate. When they come together in negotiating conference, which Speaker Pelosi will be one of the negotiators, as well as Kevin McCarthy, as well as Schumer, as well as McConnell and appropriations chairs, they'll have to decide what from the House bill gets in. And it's unclear, and I'm going to say improbable, that we'll get those expanded measures this time around. It's not impossible, but I'm going to call it improbable, given some of the broader political priorities on the COVID relief package that Speaker Pelosi would want to see, because even though there are going to be 2 separate bills and 2 separate tracks, it's all a negotiation. I mean, it's all one big negotiation between now and the election. So we'll see appropriations language moving. You'll probably read in the press, what happened, it didn't happen, but I can tell you we're expecting no change. But the protections for medical will stay in place. We're just not expecting them to expand to adult use and having the other House protections be included. So we'll let you know when that happens, but that is a moving vehicle or moving train as we speak.
Great, thank you for that, for filling in that landscape for us. I'm gonna do a pitch again. If anyone has questions, you can go ahead and use the question function, and we are gonna move to a Q&A in just a little bit. So ask away. And Safira, I don't know if you all wanna move to the next and final slide.
Yeah, we can.
This is the final slide I have.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, perfect.
Great.
I thought it was, but I thought maybe I forget something. I think we're actually ready to take it for questions. We wanted to give ourselves a good, good amount of time for questions.
Absolutely. So feel free to submit. I've got a couple prepared. Want to talk a little bit more about the new Attorney General. Can we discuss potential impacts of a new Attorney General?
Do you want me to start, Spear? All right. I'm assuming you told me to start, even though I didn't hear you. All right. So I think something to look for in the Attorney General confirmation is you're not going to see someone who is hell-bent on prosecuting Trump. I don't think Biden will be able to move that type of person through the Senate confirmation process, which I think is why Doug Jones from Alabama became an immediately attractive pick for the Biden team. As Safira mentioned, Doug Jones is well-versed in cannabis policy, thanks to a staffer who was formerly in Jeff Merkley's office. That staffer wrote most of the original safe banking bill in the Senate. So certainly Doug understands it. We've had good positive meetings with him as a senator. Obviously for political reasons in Alabama, he couldn't be the biggest champion of cannabis reform, but certainly he has spoken out in favor of both medical and letting states decide their own policies for adult use. And, looking at the people that would be surrounding Doug Jones in, the career attorney positions, many of which are still there from when the Coleman bill came out, who are Obama appointees. or came in during the Obama era, rather. I think he would be a good steward of reasonable reforms that really show the prioritization of other issues in the Justice Department, meaning that he'd be looking at the opioid crisis, looking at undoing some of the immigration executive actions. So he would be in a position where he could say to his district attorneys, look, like, so many of states have spoken on this. Let's get them some clear guidance so they know where the Justice Department stands and where we will be spending our resources, which will not be going after state legal cannabis. So I think we're in a very good position for that if Doug Jones is the Attorney General. Of course, some other names that have been thrown out, Sally Yates, Javier Becerra, which certainly would be interesting. But I have my doubts that in addition to having Vice President Harris in the White House, having another top cop from California would be able to pass through a slim majority either way Senate. But that I think is the cabinet level position we have the most clarity around, and Doug Jones does look like the top contender at this point. Safira, anything to add to that?
Yeah. Great, thank you for that, David. Another question that we have in, what does the potential elimination of filibuster mean for reform? Can you all talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I'll start with that one, David. So as a reminder, right now in the upper chamber of the Senate, it required that we have 60 votes to basically end debate and take a vote on any measure. And it's that mechanism, that procedural process that members of one party will utilize against the other party to basically prevent a vote. And so if we want to change what is essentially, what is de facto a 60 vote requirement to end debate, the leader of the Senate would have to change the rules. And there is a mechanism to change the rules. I won't get into the details. Harry Reid kind of set the precedent many years ago, and it was what was used to actually change the number of votes required for judicial nominations. But if that were to change and the Senate no longer required 60 votes essentially to advance legislation, then a Leader Schumer would be in a position to advance a Leader Schumer's agenda. And now we look back to the states, because if you look at New Jersey's legalization success, you can imagine, and actually we had the mayor of New York City congratulating the citizens of New Jersey for their legalization reform. Adult use legalization is moving through the Northeast. Pennsylvania, New York, it is happening. It is, and so the motivation for reconciling federal and state law will be top of mind for Schumer. And I think in that scenario, we could see reform happen quickly. But as I mentioned, getting rid of those filibuster rules, that's not an inevitable reality, even if the Georgia seats go down. It's part of a bigger political question, and from the policy experts that I've read indicate that President-elect Biden is not inclined to move in that direction at this time. David, anything else to kind of characterize or correct on my end?
Yeah, I mean, with Biden not being inclined to move in that direction, Biden spent, a number of years in the Senate. He has crafted his whole campaign around healing. I imagine he's going to do everything in his power to have bipartisan agreement, even if it's not complete bipartisan agreement, picking up 6 to 7, maybe 8 Republicans on board with his packages to show that he is, at least as his campaign has framed it, a president for all Americans, not just those who voted for him. Getting rid of the filibuster is a pretty radical move. I actually think you will see more pressure to do it from Schumer than you would from the White House. And the reason for that is Schumer is going to be up for re-election in 2022. He is almost certainly going to be challenged from the left, and including a name that's been thrown out already, AOC. So if Schumer doesn't have any major policy victories as a Senate majority or minority leader, he will be, I think, a little bit antsy come late 2021, 2022, to perhaps do a rule change to move some of these more progressive policy issues if he has the majority. I think with the filibuster, we should go into next Congress operating under the assumption that it will remain intact, that we will need 60 votes for any legislative package. I think you can get there with a criminal justice reform type bill. I think you saw that with the First Step Act. There was good bipartisan support. I think a challenge that I would like to note that we didn't cover earlier is the biggest supporter of cannabis reform on the Republican side, being Cory Gardner, has lost his Senate seat. So there's certainly other Senate Republicans who are interested in reform, but no one was out there, doing floor speeches, sending letters directly to McConnell on a weekly basis. Now, I think there's certainly a very fair argument that perhaps Senator Gardner wasn't as effective as he claimed to be on the Senate floor, moving cannabis policy. There's very little actual pieces of legislation that got put into law despite his insistence. He certainly introduced a lot of bills, but I think we do need to find ourselves a new credible Republican Senate champion to have these conversations with Leader McConnell, saying this is an important issue to my state, to my constituents, and those senators are there. They just haven't necessarily stepped up into this place yet because that void had been being filled by Senator Gardner.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. We received another question about executive order and what we think this president might be able to do to progress cannabis reform. You want to take that one, Safira?
Yep, and I also want to say that I just got word, I just saw that Senator Tillis won his election, so that's resolved. So, what can be done through executive order? The way that a President-elect Biden would extend executive order would be through the agencies by reinstating coal. And I think it's actually would be interesting. David he has a subject matter expertise on the scheduling. If we wanted to deschedule, so I think the question is, I'm not sure, is could a President-elect Biden deschedule with the stroke of a pen? And the answer is he cannot. There is a procedural process by which a President-elect Biden could direct the Justice Department to direct the DEA for reconsideration. And I'm going to let David talk about the specifics. But it is an arduous process, and it would require key stakeholders in the FDA to come out and conclude some things about cannabis that are not likely at this time, for there to be something direct, a direct descheduling, or the most expedient way to get a descheduling would be via legislation, meaning a change in the statute that says cannabis is no longer on the statute. So Lindsay, I think it's worthwhile to let David just have a few bars just to say what that process is, because I think some people in the industry just think that the president, and also I think there was some rhetoric that said that Trump could do it, and that's just not correct. It's not legally correct, it's not procedurally correct. David, do you want to just explain why really quickly?
Yeah, so with administrative re or descheduling, what would have to happen is the president would direct his attorney general to consult with both the FDA and HHS. HHS does an 8-factor analysis. Among other things, it includes potential for abuse, accepted medical value, some of the same things you see actually codified in the Controlled Substances Act. The other factors deal with some availability of clinical research, but Biden wouldn't be able to say, hey, Attorney General, initiate this process for descheduling. He would have to say, initiate this process and let the FDA and HHS come to the conclusion where they give you a recommendation on the appropriate status of cannabis. And that's like a very, I think, fine but unique distinction between those two statements. So I think where we saw the traction, originally then candidate Bernie Sanders, had made a public statement about descheduling marijuana on his first day in office. And that's not really feasible because obviously with, several government agencies reporting back and forth to one another, doing an in-depth analysis of all available information and research, that's going to take 6 months, a year, if not more. The other challenges right now is there's a legal argument that the Attorney General couldn't move cannabis beyond anything other than Schedule 2 because of the international treaties. I think that legal argument goes away once the WHO votes on their set of recommendations for the international scheduling of cannabis, which they are slated to do some of this December. I think once that vote happens, the perception that 2 is as far as the Attorney General can go will dissipate because the most frequently cited reason are those international treaties. So if there is a different consideration of cannabis, I think that opens it up for the Attorney General to have a recommendation beyond Schedule 2. But as Safira mentioned, you could change the status of cannabis legislatively by just exempting the word cannabis, marijuana, however it's defined in the statute, with a comma. And so it would say this applies to everything in this statute, comma, except for cannabis, as defined in the state of definition section. So it's a lot more straightforward in terms of process. There's less agencies involved. There's less back and forth and administration involved. But I think that if we were to go the administrative route, certainly the prospect of Mexico looking ready to set up a fully legal framework would impact that decision to go administratively. Certainly being surrounded then by countries both to our north and south with fully legal markets, as well as the growing interest of recreational cannabis in the European Union, I think would take a positive impact on the status of international treaties and our willingness to be fully compliant. But yeah, administration, rescheduling, descheduling, very complex legislation.
Yeah, sounds like it. Thank you for that that very thorough explanation, David. That was a wealth of information. And I think also too, what we've seen is that Biden in the past has had fairly old-fashioned views around cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
I know for many advocates in the space, he was probably not our first choice as a champion for reform. I think hopefully we're all changing our tune a bit on that and are seeing more opportunities than not to engage and to help influence some of this reform effort. So would love to take a minute here and kind of last question. We have a lot of members who run successful businesses. They're looking to plug in. They're trying to figure out how they can potentially take, their concerns and their advocacy one step further. So I want to talk with you all about what you think the most effective ways to really advocate for change are. And since we work so closely on state level and federal level advocacy for cannabis businesses, I think it's important for us to look at that piece and chat a little. Go for it.
So I'm actually glad that question came up, and that is not an uncommon question because particularly industry stakeholders, they just feel like almost helpless. Like, what can I do? And I want to let this membership know that CCIA members' membership in the CCIA has been crucial for the advancement and traction for cannabis. So, and let me tell you how and why. So if you're a CCIA member, you're contributing to this organization being able to exist. And this organization is the only, well, the Oregon Cannabis Industry Association has some federal presence, but CCIA is the only state organization, largest largest cannabis industry globally, not just in the US, that has ongoing presence on the Hill. And so because your membership into CCIA is part of a thoughtful and comprehensive strategy for reform, it means that you've plugged into and invested in a very thoughtful and pragmatic approach to cannabis reform. We learned when we first made it to the HEROES Act in May. In fact, I think we had at one of our meetings like right after that happened. I was on a call with Ed Perlmutter, who is the safe baking champion of the House, and he said in front of me and God and everybody, Safira, it is because of your work with the California Cannabis Industry Association. I think that's the reason that we got into the bill. So I actually attribute where we are now with safe banking because of CCIA and because of the members. So by your membership committing to this organization, getting other people to understand that it's not just on the state level, but it's on the federal level, and being very, very kind of focused, targeted, and pragmatic about our approach, that's how they plug in, because that's how you make progress. So I hope that's helped. I didn't mean to feed the, the narrative that you, but I'm telling you, CCIA has been crucial in the traction on the Hill. So thank you for the opportunity to represent such great businesses in DC.
Well, thank you for that feedback. I mean, I think too, of those of you who aren't familiar with our federal policy advisors, it's a smaller group of advocates that we work closely with, that we often travel to DC to do direct advocacy with our representatives. So over the last couple of years, we've had the opportunity to meet with almost every one of our 52 delegates to talk about primarily about safe banking, but also about social justice and MORE Act, and really just create an opportunity for our business leaders in California to share their pain points, their feedback, everything that is affecting their ability to run successful businesses in the state, including job creation and tax revenue and all of that, with their representatives. And I feel that those meetings have been really beneficial because it's they now look to us as industry experts, but also folks who are going to give real feedback. And so I've been very appreciative of that outlet, and in terms of us being able to take the concerns that we know can really only be solved on the federal level, and having that translated, essentially through California businesses. And I think that messaging has moved the needle. And then certainly all of the folks that contributed to the efforts to our huge letter writing campaign and contacting their delegates around the heroes. I think that's work that we can be proud of for sure, and hopefully will end up moving the needle in the long run. So if folks are interested in learning more about the Federal Policy Advisors Group, contact me. You can contact Safira. It's essentially for CCIA members who want to do a deeper dive into federal policy reform, and we're happy to share more information on that. But with that, we are right at time, and I'm so grateful for both David and Safira for coming on today and walking us through the always complicated federal landscape, although I feel that today we have a little bit more to be happy about than we did last week, and hopefully that momentum will continue. Obviously, all of this work can really only be made possible by your membership. So thank you to everyone for supporting CCIA, and definitely for keeping the wheels moving. Progress is around the corner, but it's slow moving. So we got to band together, and we absolutely have to celebrate the small victories, because that's pretty much what we're getting these days. So small, but thank you both so much. Lovely to see you, and yeah, we'll talk soon.
Great. Thanks so much, Lindsay, and best and safety and sanity to all.
Yes, indeed. All right. We'll talk very soon. Thank you.
All right.